name is Alaast Kamalabadi. And thank you all who are joining today. My research project in its current iteration is titled The Corpus of Consumption, the post-anthropophagic bodies of contemporary Brazilian art. My faculty advisor is Dr. Alexandra LeBlanc from the Department of Art History. So, Brazilian art has always subsisted on notions of carnivorous cosmopolitanism and cannibalistic nativism, and on consumption and self-identification. Don't worry, I will sort of go deeper into that later. So my research investigates the development of contemporary Brazilian art through the lenses of anthropophagia, an artistic and literary movement that began in 1928. That premised anthropological views of cannibalism as a mode of representation, and also Brasilidade, which is another movement, national aesthetic project that began in the 20s. So I'd like to literalize some of these readings and look at how contemporary Brazilian artists fold discourses of racial and cultural identity and address historical issues such as imperialism, slavery, and the indigenous past through the use of crops, agricultural materials, and edible materials, such as coffee, palm oil, corn, sugar, beans, and Brazil wood, but also look at how, analyze how their works embody and continue to engage with the principles of anthropophagia through the physical body as a locus of performance, or through abstracted conceptions of the anthropophagic Brazilian corpus. So, introduction and framework. How can we understand contemporary Brazilian art? So, as I said, if we are looking through the lens of anthropophagia, which was in brief the wholesale adoption of the notion of cannibalism, the ritual consumption of flesh, made infamous through colonial ethnographic and anthropological endeavors that often sensationalized what was actually a fairly isolated practice across indigenous cultures in Brazil. They took that as a sociological, literary, and artistic framework for a new ideology that marries Brazil's national, international, cultural, and racial identity. Then that's Brasilidade. That's where that comes into context. So again, I'm going to be looking at mostly material analyses, food, agriculture, and body, and also symbolic analyses. So, project scope. I will be looking at art from the late 1960s to the 2010s, and I'm going to be covering these four artists mainly: Ayrton Heraclito, Artur Barrio, Antonio Henrique Amaral, and Ligia Pape. So I'm going to be doing a formal, thematic, and material analysis predominantly, and also looking at historical context and art historical context. And for texts, I am splitting it between primary documents and secondary documents, so journals and manifestos mostly. And these are the databases that I will be using. I'll be using the UC Library Search and the ICAA documents of Latin American and Latino art, and also JSTOR. So, as I said, Brasilidade was it was a national aesthetic project, and it was mostly and also an industrial project, and attempted to define Brazilian identity. And here we see the work of Roberto Burle Marx, who incorporated indigenous and local flora into architectural landscaping. And as you may see from these buildings by Oscar Niemeyer, architecture under Brasilidade was also closely allied with the international style. So it was mostly a utopian conception of national identity. And anthropophagia, here we have engravings by Theodore de Bry, based on Hans Steden's travel account of Brazil in the Tupinamba tribe, who are, they're this they're an indigenous they were an indigenous tribe that populated Brazil before it was colonized. So here we see the inhabitants engaging in cannibalism. These are obviously staged from recollection. So obviously it's a very, we should be complicating these depictions. Often they were sensationalized, and they were more for titillating people's like European curiosity about what was happening overseas. So, and here we have two works by Tarsila do Armara, who was one of the founders of the anthropophagia movement. Again, we see natural forms, themes of renewal, and the indigenous flora. So, the Manifesto Anthropophagia is essentially a cannibalistic cultural hermetics. They declare a utopian vision of society that neither apes nor rejects European culture, but devours it, adapting its strengths and incorporating them into the native self. And now we're going to move on to contemporary artists and how they engage with these two notions that I just established. So this is the work of Ligia Papi. This is Eat Me, made in 1975. I will be skipping over this, but I would like to focus on this. Ligia Papi, Lingua Abunhalada, which means cut tongue. So this work deals with the theme of trauma as a political symbol, and we see the tongue is bleeding. It seems to be bleeding, but in the black and white picture, it also looks like ink. So at the same time, it's evoking blood and ink, and it's tying these two together. They're saying, because they are both arterial processes, they both involve circulation. So this work talks about the body and the act of ingestion as a political gesture. And also it's talking about, you know, the period of censorship that the artist Ligia Papi had to work through in the 60s. The news, she alleges that, you know, she's commenting on the twofold effect of censorship, the suppression of speech and the enfeeblement of taste. And by taste, I do not actually simply mean the culinary palates, but also one's artistic, literary, and political diet. And because taste is inextricable from consumption, the consumption of culture, the consumption of art, and the consumption of news. And here we see Ligia Papi engaging with an earlier work by Tarsila do Amaral. Remember the painting with the egg? This work is titled O Ovo, which means the egg. So she's again tapping into the same notions of rebirth and renewal. And here in Divisor, which means divider, we see the bodies of Brazilian children swallowed up in this material. It seems to comment on this notion of suspension of it. Like, imagine a liquid with a lot of particles floating in it, and these particles are diffusing and expanding and contracting. So they're like particles suspended in a liquid. And if we look at this later work by Ayrton Heraclito, also titled Divisor, we again see the same notion of suspension and diffusion. Heraclito through a chemical process, and Pape through an abstracted visual representation of the particular physics of suspension, magnified and enacted symbolically through the body as a site of action. So again, we see, so with Heraclito's Divisor, the separation is a little more apparent. And in fact, I would also like to point out the material he is using. He is using dende, which is palm oil, and it's suspended in saline water, which represents the sea, the oceans of Aceh Bahia, which is a coastal region of Brazil. So it almost looks like an extruded Rothko. The yellow of the oil is largely petitioned, cutting an mostly clean line across the center of the tank. And by mixing a cooking ingredient with a paint pigment, Heraclito equivocates the act of cooking with art. And here we have the body of cooking and art broken down into the particulate. So the dende itself is also heavily infused with symbolism and cultural significance, from its association with Afro-Brazilian food to its ritual uses. And this reading is supported by Heraclito himself in an interview with Video Brasil. He says that he equates the substance to the vital liquid, the semen, the blood, and the saliva of the Bahian cultural body. Of course, his vision of anthropophagy, or his post-anthropophagic vision, is a little more cynical than Ligia Pape's. He's still pointing to, because the liquid divisions here are far more stark, unincorporated, and it cuts his tank in two. It's a metaphor for persisting divisions, racial divisions, and class lines, and the uneasiness of racial integration that continues to today. So, in conclusion, whereas Ligia Pape's cut tongue features the mouth as a site of consumption and therefore points to the individual, the respective divisors by Pape and Heraclito deal with the themes of consumption and anthropophagy on a societal scale. And I mean, why else did Pape use children in her divisor? Children represent the product of a union between two individuals. They represent cultural legacy, ancestral lineage, and racially porous future. And Heraclito, born to a father of African Amerindian heritage and a mother of Italian and Portuguese descent, would certainly have resonated with her message of assimilation, but he is a little more clear-eyed about the leaps and bounds that Brazilian society still has to go to achieve racial and socioeconomic parity, countering the porosity of De Andrade, who was the founder of anthropophagy, and even Pape's narrative. So, here are my questions for the future. I've looked at these two artists in detail, and I've written basically a chapter of the 30 to 40 pages I have planned. And in the future, I want to look at how the rise of critical race theory in Latin America, in Latin American scholarship, has changed how anthropophagia is studied and defined, and also how it has changed art historical literature. And I also want to look at Tropicalia, which is an artistic and cultural movement of the 60s that incorporated more Brazilian materials. And I want to look at how they changed contemporary artists' conceptions of body and consumption, and how do they mix in with these previous two frameworks. And I also want to uncover some more explicit readings and also delve into other modes of material analyses. Here are my references. And I would like to express my appreciation to my faculty and mentor, Dr. LeBlanc. She's provided so much guidance. I would also like to thank the MMUF program coordinators and staff, and also UCR Student Engagement for hosting this. And here is my contact details.
That was extraordinarily impressive. Well done. Questions? We've got about 3 minutes left of the session. Wait, there's one chat question. It is, oh, I'm sorry. Any questions, folks? That's amazing. Yeah. So I'll just throw it out, but ignorant question from the outside. is this the artists who showed us these depictions? Are these, about as far as you can push it, or are there many others that deal with the same themes?
There are others that deal with the same thing. I just, for time
No.
constraints, I just focused on these two artists, but this
Right,
is
sure.
sort of indicative of the sort of analyses I want to apply to other artists as well.
So you've got kind of a sweep of a century of Brazilian art, really. Is it more common earlier, or has it become more common now, or has it always been there?
What do you mean by more common?
This discussion about, you know, slightly cannibalistic notions. I mean, has that always been there, or was it becoming more common as a discussion in Brazil, more common to see in Brazilian art?
Yeah. So it does seem to be, I mean, there are other instances or documented instances anthropologically of cannibalism in other Latin American countries, but Brazil seems to have, because these two, Brasilidade and Anthropophagia, were very conscious national projects that thinkers and a lot of politicians and builders consciously evoked. I think it was a little more cemented into the Brazilian cultural history. And also, I mean, it really began in the 20s, then it sort of petered off. And then we see this resurgence of artists dealing with these same concepts and using food materials. I kind of skimmed over, but we saw I think some of you saw flashes of images of uh, Ayrton Heraclito's portraits of Afro-Brazilian people engulfed in beans and corn and these other materials. So,
It's extraordinary. Just, we're running out of time, so I need to sum up. But I think anyone who's sat through these presentations can have absolutely no doubt about the extraordinary work our undergraduates are doing here, and it's really, kind of truly inspirational. I mean, I wish, I hope the recordings are spread